Tonight, we drift away from the noise of the day, away from the rush of thoughts, the weight of worries, the endless hum of the waking world. Instead, we step into something quieter, something older, something that has been waiting, perhaps, for centuries to be remembered. History is often told as a story of battles and kings, of loud moments that echo through time. But there is another history, a softer one. The history of those who walked quietly, who dreamed in silence, who left their mark not in thunder, but in the slow turning of seasons, the patient rise of ideas, the gentle unraveling of mysteries. Have you ever wondered what it might feel like to fall into history the way you fall into sleep? To let the weight of the past carry you, not with excitement, but with calm? To hear the voices of those who came before not as lessons to be learned, but as stories to be held, softly, until your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts begin to drift? If this is the kind of journey that calls to you, take a moment to subscribe to Little Historical. It helps a small channel continue to bring stories that are meant to be savored, not rushed. And if you are watching from somewhere quiet, somewhere the night has already settled, let me know in the comments. There is comfort, I think, in knowing that others are drifting alongside you, carried by the same words, the same silence, the same slow turning of the world toward rest. Now, let the light dim. Let the room grow still. And let us begin. Nikola Tesla entered the world on a night that seemed torn between heaven and earth. It was July 10, 1856, and a thunderstorm raged over the small mountain village of Smiljan, nestled in what was then the Austrian Empire, now Croatia. As the wind howled and lightning split the sky, Tesla's mother labored by candlelight. A midwife, unnerved by the storm, whispered that this was a bad omen. But his mother, Nikola Tesla, simply smiled and replied, "No, he will be a child of light." That single phrase would come to define him. His father was a stern Serbian Orthodox priest, a man of letters and logic. He wanted his son to follow a path of religion and language. But his mother had no formal education, yet she possessed a rare mechanical genius. She built household tools from scratch, invented devices to ease daily chores, and could recite entire epic poems from memory. Tesla would later credit her as the true source of his inventive mind. From a young age, Nikola stood apart. His memory was photographic. He could read a book once and quote it line by line. His imagination was boundless, so vivid that images would appear before his eyes like waking dreams. He began to see flashes of light and experience hallucinations. At times, the line between his mind and the outside world seemed to blur. He would later describe these moments not as madness, but as a gift, an ability to visualize entire machines with precision down to the bolts and spinning gears before ever lifting a tool. He was also deeply sensitive to patterns, sounds, and numbers. He had peculiar habits that would follow him his entire life. He avoided touching hair, couldn't bear the sight of pearls, and was obsessed with the number 3. If he entered a building, he would walk around it 3 times. These were not just quirks. They were part of a mind finely attuned to the rhythm of the universe. Though few understood him, the young boy from Smiljan was already dreaming of forces no one else could see, currents that moved through the earth and sky, waiting to be harnessed. The world had no idea what had just been born into its storm. But the future would soon feel the charge. As he grew, Tesla wandered through the world with questions. Why did birds migrate without sight? What made the stars shimmer? Could energy be drawn from the earth itself? He did not just want answers. He wanted to feel the very pulse behind reality. He pursued education with relentless hunger, and in the lecture halls of Graz, surrounded by the ticking of gears and the buzz of generators, his true vision began to form. He witnessed a demonstration of a direct current motor, and it sparked in his mind a quiet rebellion. He imagined something better, a world powered by alternating current, where energy flowed back and forth in waves, efficient and powerful, capable of traveling great distances with minimal loss. To his professors, the idea seemed absurd. But Tesla did not argue. He simply stored the vision deep in his mind, where it grew, refined, and evolved like a living machine waiting to be born. Years later, he stepped off a boat in New York City with 4 cents in his pocket, a head full of inventions, and a letter of recommendation addressed to Thomas Edison. The city was alive with chaos and the newborn hum of electric lights. Edison hired him immediately. But the two men were opposites. Edison believed in trial and error. Tesla built his machines in the mind first. When Tesla proposed a redesign of Edison's direct current systems, Edison reportedly promised $50,000 if he could make it work. When Tesla did, Edison waved it off as a joke. Disillusioned, Tesla left. For a time, he dug ditches to survive, his hands in the dirt while his mind remained in the clouds, sketching systems of wireless energy. Out of rejection came resolve. He found backers, established his own laboratory, and began building his alternating current motors. When George Westinghouse licensed his patents, the war of currents began. Edison staged gruesome demonstrations to brand AC as dangerous, but Tesla trusted the science. When the 1893 World's Fair lit up with over 100,000 electric bulbs powered by his system, the world saw the future. And when his alternating current was chosen to harness Niagara Falls, Tesla had won. But the spotlight shifted. He turned his mind to wireless power, building the Wardenclyffe Tower to transmit energy freely across the globe. When financier J.P. Morgan learned that Tesla intended to give electricity away for free, he withdrew his support. "Where do I put the meter?" he reportedly asked. The tower was never completed. It stood for years, a monument to a dream few understood, until it was dismantled for scrap in 1917. In his later years, Tesla lived alone in hotel rooms, feeding pigeons in Bryant Park, speaking softly to them as if they were old friends. He dressed immaculately in white suits, even when he had no money to eat. He followed rituals tied to the number 3, touched doorknobs 3 times, walked around buildings 3 times. The world saw an eccentric old man. But inside his mind, the universe was still alive with vibration and frequency. On January 7, 1943, in room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel, Tesla passed away alone. He was 86 years old. A maid found him the next morning, lying peacefully in bed. His papers were seized by the FBI, his debts unpaid, his name fading from memory. But the ideas he left behind, scribbled in the margins of books, scattered in drawers, would echo far beyond that quiet hotel room. Tesla taught us that the future belongs to the dreamers, that the quiet thinkers often carry within them the sparks that will one day light the way for us all. And as we drift toward sleep, his spirit still hums softly in the wires above us, invisible, eternal, waiting to be heard. From the quiet solitude of a forgotten genius, we now turn to a very different kind of light, one that burned in a city by the sea, where the knowledge of the ancient world was gathered, preserved, and nearly lost forever. From the quiet solitude of a forgotten genius, we now turn to a very different kind of light, one that burned in a city by the sea, where the knowledge of the ancient world was gathered, preserved, and nearly lost forever. Long ago, on the shimmering edge of the Mediterranean, a city rose from vision. Its name was Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great around 331 BCE. Though Alexander would die young and never see the city completed, his dream lingered in its marble streets and sea-swept harbors. After his death, one of his generals, Ptolemy Isota, took control of Egypt. He made Alexandria his capital, and under his rule the city blossomed. More than just a center of trade or politics, it became something rare, a place devoted to learning. Ptolemy envisioned a home for all the world's knowledge, not just a collection of scrolls, but a sanctuary of wisdom. A place where the great questions of life, the cosmos, and human existence could be asked quietly, patiently, without fear. Thus, the dream of the Library of Alexandria was born. It began not with stone walls or columns, but with an idea that knowledge should not be hoarded or hidden, but gathered and shared. The library would be part of a larger institution, the Mauseon, a sanctuary dedicated to the muses, goddesses of inspiration and the arts. Together, they would become the heartbeat of Alexandria's intellect. The goal was simple yet impossibly ambitious: to collect every book, every scroll, every fragment of thought in every language from every land. Agents were sent across the world to acquire manuscripts. Ships entering Alexandria's port were searched, and their books were copied, sometimes kept. The city became a beacon, drawing scholars, poets, mathematicians, and philosophers from Greece, India, Mesopotamia, and beyond. No one knew how much knowledge the human mind could hold, but in Alexandria, they intended to find out. It is said that the first librarians walked through columns lined with papyrus scrolls, their sandals echoing in vaulted halls. They whispered in Greek, in Egyptian, in languages now lost to time. And in those moments, for the first time in history, humanity began to see itself not as scattered tribes or empires, but as a species capable of learning together. The Library of Alexandria did not begin as a building. It began as a flame that would burn bright and fragile at the heart of the ancient world. Within its halls, scholars like Euclid laid the foundations of geometry. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy. Herophilus mapped the nervous system, understanding the brain as the seat of thought centuries before such ideas were accepted. And Aristarchus of Samos proposed that the Earth revolved around the Sun, an idea the world would not embrace for another 2,000 years. But this was not just a place of storage. It was a place of conversation. Ideas were not owned, they were shared. Philosophy blended with science. Medicine drew upon astronomy. Knowledge was not divided into neat categories, but flowed like water through the minds of those who gathered there. And for a little while, in the bright heart of Alexandria, the world seemed to remember what it meant to seek truth without fear. Yet no light, however bright, is immune to the winds of politics and war. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria. When fighting broke out, he ordered the docks set ablaze. The flames spread, and some accounts say they reached warehouses storing scrolls, perhaps thousands of them. Was it the main library that burned, or an annex? Historians still debate. But the very idea that centuries of knowledge could vanish in a single night is almost too tragic to comprehend. Scrolls on ancient medicine, star charts, theories of the cosmos, each one erased in the blink of a flame. From the ashes of that first fire, we now turn to the scholars who kept the dream alive, to the second library that rose from the ruins, and to the quiet endurance of a city that refused to let its light go out. From the ashes of that first fire, we now turn to the scholars who kept the dream alive, to the second library that rose from the ruins, and to the quiet endurance of a city that refused to let its light go out. But before we walk those shadowed halls, there is another story that waits in the wings, a story not of a city, but of a woman. A young girl raised behind palace walls, never meant to be queen. Her name was Alexandria Victoria, born on a grey May morning in 1819 at Kensington Palace. She was fifth in line to the throne, so distant from power that few paid her any attention. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Her father died when she was an infant, leaving her mother to raise her under what became known as the Kensington system, a rigid set of rules designed to keep the young princess under constant watch. She was not allowed to be alone, even for a moment. She couldn't walk downstairs without holding someone's hand. Her friendships were controlled, her education tightly monitored. Victoria's world was narrow, but her mind was wide awake. She found solace in books and diaries, where she began to record her thoughts with remarkable clarity. Even as a child, her writing showed glimpses of the strong will that would define her reign. She was observant, emotional, and fiercely independent beneath the surface. Her isolation made her observant. Her restrictions made her resilient. By the time she was a teenager, a series of unexpected deaths among her relatives had brought her closer to the throne. At age 11, she reportedly looked at a family tree and realized her destiny. "I will be good," she said simply, a promise whispered in a child's voice that would echo through one of the longest and most transformative reigns in British history. On a grey June morning in 1837, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain arrived at Kensington Palace. The old king had died during the night. Victoria had just turned 18, old enough to rule in her own right. When they informed her of the news, she stood quietly and said with composure far beyond her years, "I will do my utmost to be worthy of my people." It was the beginning of a new chapter, not only for her, but for an entire empire. Her first acts as queen were marked by quiet strength. One of her first requests was to move out of her mother's apartments and into her own chambers at Buckingham Palace. For the first time in her life, she was alone and free. She leaned on Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister, a kind, fatherly figure whose guidance gave her confidence. But her reign began with missteps. She made enemies by interfering in court appointments and was criticized for being too attached to her favorites. Yet she took her duties seriously, reading every document presented to her and attending meetings with ministers. She believed deeply in the responsibility of her role. But there was no denying the loneliness. She was surrounded by advisors, courtiers, and attendants, but few friends. Her mother remained distant, her court full of protocol, and every step she took was watched and weighed. Victoria was a queen, but she was still a young woman, newly thrust into the harsh light of power. In the quiet halls of her palace, she ruled alone, and waited for someone to stand beside her. That someone arrived in October 1839. His name was Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, her cousin from Germany. When they met again, Victoria wrote in her diary, "It was with some emotion that I beheld Albert. He is so handsome, so delightful." Only 5 days later, she proposed to him. As queen, it was her privilege to ask. He could not. They were married on February 10, 1840, in a simple ceremony at St. James's Palace. Victoria wore white, a tradition she helped start, and a wreath of orange blossoms. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows, and crowds gathered in celebration. Their marriage began as a deep and joyful love. Victoria adored Albert, calling him her angel, her dearest treasure. He became not just her husband, but her closest advisor. With his keen mind and quiet discipline, Albert brought order to Victoria's often fiery nature. They were opposites, she passionate, he reserved, but together they created a powerful partnership. He modernized the monarchy, advised ministers, and promoted science, education, and technology. His fingerprints were on everything from palace reform to the Great Exhibition of 1851. They had 9 children, and Victoria found joy in motherhood, though she often felt torn between public duty and private life. But life does not grant forever. In the winter of 1861, Albert fell ill. At first it seemed like exhaustion, but his condition worsened quickly. On December 14, at just 42 years old, Prince Albert died at Windsor Castle. Victoria was shattered. She locked herself away in grief, wearing black mourning clothes the very next day. She would wear them for the rest of her life. For more than a decade, she rarely appeared in public. She refused to enter Buckingham Palace, preferring the quieter retreats of Balmoral and Osborne House. Parliament grew impatient. Newspapers criticized her absence. But though she withdrew from sight, she did not abandon her duties. From her secluded rooms, she continued to govern, reading state papers and corresponding with ministers. Her mourning became legendary. She kept Albert's rooms untouched, his clothes laid out each day as if he might return. She wrote of him constantly, calling him her beloved, her precious angel. Her grief shaped the rest of her reign, and yet, in her mourning, she created something enduring, a queen wrapped in black, enduring sorrow with dignity. In 1897, she reached a milestone few monarchs had ever seen: 60 years on the throne. The Diamond Jubilee was planned as a global event. From every corner of the empire, dignitaries and soldiers traveled to London. Victoria, by now frail and in her late 70s, appeared in her carriage wearing black with silver accents. Crowds erupted into cheers. They saw not just a queen, but an era made flesh. She had outlived her husband, many of her friends, and even some of her own children. She had reigned through war and invention, political upheaval and industrial transformation. And now she sat at the center of an empire unlike any the world had ever seen. On January 22, 1901, as twilight fell, Queen Victoria passed away. She was 81 years old. She had asked not to be buried in black, but in white, with her wedding veil placed over her face. She was laid to rest beside Prince Albert, reuniting the love story that had shaped her soul. With her death, the Victorian era came to a close. She had ruled longer than any before her, and when she finally closed her eyes, a chapter in history ended. Not with fanfare, but with the soft silence of a queen who had given her entire life to a crown and a people. From her long reign of duty and devotion, we now turn to a different kind of endurance, the endurance of a language lost for over 1,000 years, and the stone that brought it back to life. From her long reign of duty and devotion, we now turn to a different kind of endurance, the endurance of a language lost for over 1,000 years, and the stone that brought it back to life. There was a time when Egyptian hieroglyphs were not a mystery. when priests and scribes wrote prayers and laws across stone walls, and every curve of a bird, every mark of a reed, held meaning. The temples of Karnak, the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, these were not silent ruins. They were once filled with stories, names, and divine poetry, etched in a language meant for gods and kings. But time, as it often does, closed the book. As centuries passed, the old knowledge faded. Egypt was conquered by Persians, then by Greeks, and later by the Romans. Each new ruler brought new tongues, new traditions. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE, long after most had already forgotten how to read it. And then nothing. The scribes died. The priests vanished. The keys to understanding were lost. For over 1400 years, no one could read the writings on Egypt's ancient walls. The meaning of the hieroglyphs slipped into silence. Scholars admired their elegance, their mystery, but guessed wildly at their meaning. Some thought they were purely symbolic, mystic images with no relation to language. Others believed they were magical charms. No one could read the stories carved into the very bones of Egypt. The tomb of Tutankhamun, the mighty reign of Ramses, the wisdom of scribes, all of it locked behind symbols no one could unlock. Then, in the summer of 1799, something changed. In the dirt near a small Egyptian town called Rosetta, a piece of black stone was found. It was chipped and broken, but something about it felt different. It carried writing, not just in the mysterious hieroglyphs, but also in Greek. And suddenly, for the first time in over 1,000 years, there was hope. Hope that ancient Egypt might speak again. The stone measured about 3 feet 9 inches tall, made from a dark granodiorite. Its true weight was not physical. It carried the weight of a lost language. Scholars quickly recognized that the Greek text could be read, and if the message was the same across all 3 scripts, then this stone could be a bridge. The race to decipher the hieroglyphs had begun. For years, scholars across Europe pored over copies of the stone. Some made progress with the middle script, Demotic, identifying proper names like Alexander and Ptolemy. But the hieroglyphs remained stubbornly silent, until a young French scholar named Jean-François Champollion turned his attention to the puzzle. He had mastered Coptic, the last living descendant of ancient Egyptian, and he believed that the old language still breathed in its words. He studied the stone obsessively, comparing the cartouches, the oval rings that surrounded royal names, with Greek equivalents. In 1822, after years of quiet work, Champollion had his breakthrough. He discovered that hieroglyphs were not just pictures. Many of them represented sounds. He could read the names of Ptolemy and Cleopatra, and then, trembling, he began to decipher the rest. He rushed to his brother's office, burst through the door, and shouted, "JTN's mon affaire. I've got it," then fainted from the sheer force of the moment. Champollion's work tore the veil from the hieroglyphs. For the first time in over a millennium, the voices of ancient Egypt began to speak. Temples that had stood in silence for centuries revealed the names of kings, the stories of gods, the private hopes of everyday people. The Book of the Dead unfolded line by line. The wisdom of the pharaohs was no longer mute. Champollion died young, at just 41, but he had done something extraordinary. He had given a civilization back its voice. And it all began with a single stone in the dirt, a stone that reminds us that even the most silent past can be made to speak again, if only we have the patience to listen.